Yeah, so for everybody that doesn't know SAE Society, there are some people here that are primarily scientists, for example. There's other people from the sort of larger storytelling world that maybe you haven't heard much about us. We're the sort of central society of the entertainment industry when it comes to caring about social impact and how social impact should be looked at, treated in a responsible way, and how we can tell stories with impact that are also profitable, that are actually smart business cases and that work within the Hollywood system. And so we try to bring these two worlds of impact and mainstream storytelling together with panels like the one today. And so for everybody that is a little bit confused about what this panel might be about, you'll be illuminated very shortly. We've got two incredible speakers that joined us, and that's a real privilege to have these two great minds that are sort of at the top of their individual fields, both in the same room at the same time and having sort of a shared conversation. So big thank you both to Scott and George for joining us. And also a big extra shout out for Kate Fulp to helping getting Scott into our orbit. Kate, she works at Hollywood Health and Society, which is also a really great organization that brings together scientists and storytellers. And so all of this works within a very large ecosystem that gets bigger every day when more and more people in the entertainment industry are interested in creating an impact, and more impact people are interested in using entertainment as a vehicle for getting across really important ideas that the world needs to care about. So again, today's panel, we're going to dive into a very complicated topic, and we're totally aware that some of these things in the science world are really hard to understand for people that are not in the science world. So we will make sure that everything stays really easy to comprehend, something that is accessible to everyone. George is, of course, somebody that could easily teach at his many Harvard or MIT lectures, but we're going to try to keep it simpler for the ones among us today that are not geneticists by trade. And similarly, on the storytelling side, we're also going to try to make storytelling accessible to the scientists that are present today. So this is sort of a big bridge building exercise, which is really great. Basically, at the end of the panel, we're going to give you a link to a resource that both storytellers and scientists can use. It's basically a storyteller's guide to the idea of de-extinction and how it can utilize it in storylines. So with that, we'll get started. So I'll quickly give an introduction to Scott, and then I'll hand it off to Jillian of PG Ed to give an introduction to George. And then both Scott and George get to obviously talk about themselves. We just want to give everybody a really quick idea. So for those people that have not seen Scott's latest show, Extrapolations on Apple TV+, it's a really cool show on climate change. It's sort of an idea about the future and what the near future might look like. But this is not the first thing that Scott has done. After a really illustrious career in advertising, sort of Scott's big claim to fame was producing An Inconvenient Truth, a documentary that sort of shook the world and probably cemented what participant media is today. And he quickly parlayed that into writing The Bourne Ultimatum, Contagion, The Informant, and basically directing, producing, and writing a lot of movies that all of us have seen and all of us have really been touched by. Basically, a huge thank you, Scott, for coming and speaking today. It's really great to have you. I'll hand it off to Jillian for a quick intro to George.
Thanks so much, Toby. Our team is totally thrilled to be co-presenting this event with the SIE Society. At PG Ed, we recognize the power of storytelling for making significant and positive social change. And we hope that by bringing together experts in entertainment and in science, that we can inspire the creation of media that explores the complexity of the world, its history, and also the interplay of science and society. And our collaboration aims to drive social change by offering storytelling events and resources for SIE Society members. And we hope that you can get inspired and involved. And we're excited to kick off the conversation, but I would like to give first quick introduction for Dr. George Church. George is a professor at Harvard Medical School and MIT, serves as a core faculty member for Harvard's Wyss Institute and oversees the synthetic biology platform. He's renowned for his groundbreaking contributions to genomics and has co-founded approximately 50 biotechnology companies, including Colossal Biosciences, and played a pivotal role in developing the first genomic sequencing method in 1984. Throughout his career, he has received numerous prestigious awards to recognize his achievements and contributions to the scientific field. And I am just thrilled to welcome both Scott and George to our Zoom stage. So I would like to now pass it back to you, Toby.
Perfect. Cool. Yeah. If anybody has no idea who the hell I am and why I'm even running this panel, so I actually co-authored the De-Extinction storytelling guide. So I've learned way too much about this topic as a filmmaker, but I'm also a filmmaker, producer. I directed a show on HBO Max called Gaming Wall Street, and I co-founded the SAE Society. So I'm kind of in the middle of a lot of these different conversations, and it's awesome to have this kind of conversation that I think is super rare. So we'll basically bounce it around. It's going to be a really nice conversation, and hopefully for everybody, there's going to be a lot of pieces to learn and to take home and to utilize in your own, whether it's movies, TV shows, games, or if it's in a scientific field and in the science communications world, where it's really important to be able to tell a story about the importance of the science that you're working on. So we'll get started with Scott. So Scott, I would love to know, you've done a lot of different things. Obviously, producing a documentary and show running a show on Apple TV Plus are wildly different actual activities. But there's sort of a line that I can see in your work, which is all around science fiction. So what made you fascinated with writing, producing, and directing science fiction?
I think, well, let's first have a little conversation about terms. It's unfortunate that science fiction has become relegated to, the part of the bookstore or the part of Amazon where it is, because it used to be a great vehicle for thought experiments around society, and now it seems to be, the ugly version of fiction. And so I tend to try and think about it as speculative storytelling. I think I like people like George Orwell more than a lot of straight up science fiction writers. So I guess what I try and do is start with the science and try and learn what I can about what is possible in a certain field. Certainly with contagion, that's where we started. I went to Larry Brilliant, who at the time had just left Google, and Ian Lipkin in New York, and I sat down with them and I said, I don't want to do something that is sensationalistic. I want to stay within the bounds of science. And what you quickly learn, and I'm very interested in hearing what George has to say about this, is that so much is possible, especially in the world of viruses, that you quickly recognize that you do have the freedom that you would have if you were simply using, the giant box of crayons that comes with fiction. But for me, I guess I always want to start, whether it was, an inconvenient truth or extrapolations, with what is possible, and go from there. So that's sort of my opening salvo in science fiction. Is I tend to think of it more as world building, using the building blocks that we currently have.
And particularly, what about that drew you to it? Is it that you love to build worlds? Is there something that you're trying to find within it?
I think I just have always been drawn to what if questions. I mean, a lot of my sort of reading is in nonfiction. I've always been excited by science. My parents, my father especially, was a scientist when he was in school. So I'm really interested in what it looks like when we take science from the laboratory, from the research paper, and try, not to use the unfortunate title of my show, but extrapolate out into the world how that science might come to appear before us when we factor in capitalism, when we factor in the ego of people making it, when we factor in all of these other things that tend not to be in the science paper, and how the world is going to react to that. And also the cross-fertilization of these ideas, whether it's something, in Extrapolations, we have an episode that takes on geoengineering. And geoengineering, I could do, 10 shows on. And, there are people who would argue that it may in fact be the best solve that we have at this point, because we are so far behind doing anything to stop climate change, that it may be the only way to stop real devastating warming. On the other hand, it's interesting to me that it also is quite likely permission for oil companies to drill and burn every possible drop if we can figure out a way to protect us from, going above 2 degrees. So I tend to go to that part of the story and go, okay, that begins to sound like an interesting plot. And I guess that's what I do.
That's awesome. Perfect. So George, what, from the people, especially the people here that chose to be storytellers, that chose to go into the field of entertainment, which is probably equally unglorious many times as science is, but what drew you to something that is so hyper specialized and so deep, and then drove you to basically spend your entire life's energy on building this this massive career of this research that you've done as a geneticist? What drew you to genetics in the first place, and then what kept you in it?
Yeah, I think what drew me in was really interest in biology and computers, which were very different in my mind when I started. I got biology was because I was surrounded by amazingly rich ecosystems, the mud flats in Florida and the Appalachian forests, and I just fascinated by nature. Then I was fascinated by the unnatural. That my third father was a physician, so he had all these unnatural, drugs in his black bag that he would carry around the house call. And then my fascination with computers came together with the biology, because I started to realize that DNA was just G, A, T, and C, and computers were just zeros and ones, and they were really very digital and very simple, long strings, like long sentences made up of just 2 or 4 characters. and that fascinated me. And then sort of the way it affected everything. You said it's very specialized, but I think it's like both of those things are where you can finally be a generalist again. You can be Leonardo. If you're a computer scientist, there's nothing that you can't do. And if you're a geneticist, or for that matter, synthetic biologist, there's nothing you can't make, because life engineers at the atomic level, which most other engineering disciplines don't. And then finally, the thing that maybe even earlier got me interested in genetics was I had some friends that were identical twins, and it was amazing how identical they were. I was just blown away by how this was genetics could affect everything in our bodies. Now, I think since then I've gotten a little more sophisticated and realized that there's some things that are not determined by genetics, but it seems so deterministic in these 2 individuals. And then looking at dogs and dog breeds, how true the dog breed was, but whenever they mated, did you get mutts? And so it's just so evident to my little 8-year-old self that, the 13-year-old self, that genetics was very powerful. So got curiosity.
That's awesome. Yeah, I feel like a lot of the people that are interested in science fiction are also a little bit of a backyard scientist themselves, and just love the sort of exploratory component of it. So Scott, I think a lot of people have obviously seen a Bourne Ultimatum. I think nearly everybody here on the call has seen An Inconvenient Truth. Most have seen Informant. I don't know if everybody saw Extrapolations. It's just a year old, so people kind of, some things like take time and gesture and whatever. So I'd love to know, can you just give people a general idea of what is Extrapolations about, and maybe what made you create that show? Because I can see a very clear connection to Inconvenient Truth, but maybe there's a bigger sort of overarching theme that led you to doing it.
Yeah, look, when I finished An Inconvenient Truth, Davis Guggenheim, who was the director of that movie, and I lived in the same neighborhood, and Davis and I used to get together and have breakfast every few months, and we felt, to be completely honest, like we'd failed. We really thought that the movie would change things, and it was so clear that very little was actually changing when you looked at the scale of change that was required. And it took quite a while for me to get to where I wanted to be, but I would sometimes be at convenings not unlike this, where people, would look at me and go, "Well, you're the storyteller. You fix it. All of our problems can be fixed by stories." And that may be true, but all of our problems are definitely caused by stories, and many of those stories, as we now know, are misinformation. But for me, what I wanted to do was take all of the data that I had learned from reading IPCC reports, from reading up on, on genetics and what was possible in terms of the solves to climate change, looking at all of the science. And we had a writer's room at one point, and, we identified the year where it was most likely that the last Pinot Noir grape would go extinct in Napa Valley. So that's how granular we went into the science. We had a lot of leaders come and speak to our room about what they thought was possible. And that's a really important sentence. It wasn't, sometimes people have seen our show and said, "Well, this seems grim." And I want to assure everyone on the call, we did not choose the darkest version of the future at all. We chose a version of the future that was interesting and probable and allowed us to look at a lot of different things like species extinction, like agriculture, a lot of things, quite frankly. And it's why I was so eager to say yes, that George's research is applicable to, whether it's, how do you genetically modify seeds to tolerate drought? And again, once you have that IP, who controls it? Who owns it? What happens to the social justice part of it? What happens when people start deciding that they own the genetics of a whale or of another animal that faces extinction? Who controls that? How do we know what they're going to do with it? When I worked on Contagion, one of the things I was shocked to learn is that there are scientists who go out into the world and gather bushmeat and look at the blood. So of what people eat and kill. And one of the first things they do if they've identified a new virus is they try and register it as IP, because they know at some point if someone's going to be working against the virus, that they want in on the solve. And so there's a lot about science, and it's a longer conversation, but it's why science, it's so important that it be open source when we're talking about issues that confront humanity. But all of these things sort of coalesced, and I wanted to make a show that looked at how technology and humanity was going to have to confront the fact that we have insatiable appetites, that we've become incredibly comfortable with using electricity, using fossil fuels, that most of human change doesn't come because we think we're ruining the planet. It comes for other motivating factors. So I wanted to do kind of a big thought experiment. And the last thing I'll say about it that I think was an important part of the show is we tend, because we have 10 of these, to have a very sort of power of 10 approach to life. And so when we made An Inconvenient Truth in 2005, everything that Vice President Gore said was, we have to do this by the end of the century, by the end of the century. Well, that was 95 years away. And the science doesn't care about how many fingers and toes we have. It doesn't care about Roman numerals. All right, it cares about CO2, and it cares about other sorts of chemical interactions. And we don't have till the end of the century. And so I wanted, if nothing else, to point out to people that, that the science requires us to come up with solutions way before the way our heads are programmed to think about, the power of 10.
That's awesome. And I think this thinking ahead and trying to anticipate and maybe being reactive in some way, but then being very forward-looking in another. Great segue to George, because for those people that are not aware, George's sort of most audacious, I don't know, George, this might be understating the rest of your work, but I think the most flashy maybe and the most memorable thing that everybody can really put their imagination behind is a thing that you've been working on now for multiple decades called De-Extinction. And can you tell us a little bit about, I know now that you're fascinated by twins, dogs, the things that sort of deterministically code our world, and how DNA is basically this giant operating system that we're all running on. But then you come to this thing where you're like, what if we brought back these kind of crazy animals that we knew roamed the earth at some point? Can you give us a little bit of an idea, like what was that initial point when you discovered that possibility, you thought about it, and we're like, you know what? How about I sink a few decades of my life into it and make leaps and bounds that nobody's ever gotten even remotely close to?
Yeah, good question. So I think I backed into De-Extinction, but I definitely had an interest in the environment. And by around 2005, I was publishing papers on the most abundant photosynthetic system in the world, which is it's also one of the slowest growing organisms, which is Prochlorococcus. It's in every ocean, and it fixes more carbon than we humans release, times about a factor of 5.
And Prochlorococcus, is this algae that we're talking about? What's the specific?
It's a cyanobacteria. It's so small that nobody discovered it until the late 80s, because you couldn't see it. It was eventually my colleague Penny Chisholm saw it, but it's intrinsic fluorescence. It has all these fluorescent things that are molecules that help photosynthesize. Anyway, this is the most abundant photosynthetic system in the world, and that fascinated me. And then today we work on the fastest growing version of that, which will double in 90 minutes. And so imagine that your cornfield doubled in 90 minutes, and then doubled, and then you got 4 of them another 90 minutes later. So that started me thinking about maybe photosynthesis was a very scalable way, where I'm always looking for ways to make things less expensive, something that Scott was alluding to, something that's equitably distributed, and it's not, and whether it's capitalism or not, it's available to everybody. Like smallpox vaccine is available to everybody now, and we don't even need the vaccine anymore because it's extinct. I was looking for something like that, a win-win that was very economical, and it seemed like photosynthesis was a good chance. And then I started learning about Sergei Zemov's work. He works in the northern most parts of Siberia, and he's a superb theorist and practical person working on the Arctic ecosystem. And he made a strong case that almost everybody was either ignoring or arguing against for a while, but I think now they're all accepting it. The case was that there was a much richer ecosystem in the Arctic not long ago, and you can start hearing the extinction coming into my tone here, answering your question. And he said that the ecosystem was a grassland, like many of our famous grasslands in the world, prairies and so forth. And it shifted over to trees when so the inconvenient truth is not the people drilling the petroleum, it's the people that killed off all the Arctic herbivores, including the mammoths. And then it converted these trees, which were really terrible, not just for the diversity, but also for trapping the heat in the winter, because the trees were just black bark, and they weren't as good at sequestering carbon as the grasses were, not by a long shot. And by trapping the snow, they trapped the summer heat in the ground, so it didn't exchange. It was like an insulating layer between it and the minus 40-degree wind. So those 3 things made this conversion from grass to trees a bad thing. And I'm as big a tree hugger as the next guy, but there are time and a place for everything. And according to Sergei Zimov, the Arctic would be much better with grasslands. Okay, so what was stopping, what stopped that was the extinction, and what could return that was a fairly tiny dose. A lot of things are highly leveraged, and a tiny dose of mammoth might restore it. And so that is, and then I realized that I had been also building up a skill set of reading and writing DNA, and that skill set was growing exponentially, meaning that we, for example, brought down the cost of DNA reading by 20 million fold in the course of a little over a decade. That doesn't happen every day, and it seemed like if you could apply that leverage to Sergei's observations about the Arctic, maybe we could get somewhere, but it had to be done very carefully and with broad discussion. And fortunately, we were far enough away from actually delivering it. There's been plenty of time for discussion, and there will be, including today. But I have more to say, but I'll keep it for later. Yeah.
I love it. I love it. Thank you for not pre-taking the other questions that I very naturally have, and I'm taking notes here all the time, so might also return to some other stuff that I've observed there. I think this is super interesting, similar to this like science dynamic that George describes here, right? Where you learn from another scientist and you're like, this is interesting, maybe X, Y, and Z, right? And sometimes that's actually real science. And sometimes it's actually science fiction that somebody wrote 100 years ago, like Jules Verne says, oh, what if we had rockets that go to the moon? And then somebody audacious says, what if we actually built these things for real, right? And so sometimes there's this science imitating other science or building on top of other science, and sometimes it's science being inspired by art or art inspiring reality. I think I, like nearly everybody else, probably looked up Contagion again once COVID happened. So there was this whole crazy thing was like, oh my God, this is crazy. Like this guy already saw it coming so long ago. And, maybe not implying that you're sort of like a future, a visionary for the future, Scott, and that you knew exactly that COVID was coming at this time and it was this kind of virus. Contagion is eerily similar to what it might be, right? And so, as far as I understand, this is because you did so much research and you talked to so many scientists that are saying like, it's not if, it's when, and this is a very likely scenario that could happen. But with that movie coming out at that time, I'm sure that a bunch of people watched it, and the ones that were smart in governments and other things, I read a bunch of articles where he basically criticized the administration at the time of saying, look, like, we don't need these things. Let's just get rid of this whole pandemic preparedness, whatever stuff. And then, of course, that would have come in really handy just a few years later. But was there a moment when Contagion actually came out where you got feedback from, be it governments, be it other people that are in a position of influence, saying, look, I never took this whole pandemic stuff seriously, but now that I watched your movie, I'm actually considering that we should implement something here and we should innovate on what this movie kind of is foretelling us? Or did people kind of say, this is never going to happen?
Well, the interesting thing, and this is applicable to extrapolations as well, and I left this out of the recipe. The most important thing for me as a storyteller is to make sure people are entertained. And if you don't tell them a good story, all you've really done is stolen their time. So I really take very seriously my obligation to make people laugh or cry or feel. With Contagion, I'll tell you this story. There's when we first premiered the movie, my little group of scientists who were very impressive said, you got everything right, Scott, except for one thing: we would never have a vaccine that fast. And among the people who said that to me was Anthony Fauci.
Wow, that's crazy.
And what Ian Lipkin and I said back to him is, we probably won't have a choice. We have never had a pandemic with this level of technology where so many people could use the internet to share data and share research. And this was a uniquely, the other thing that I just want to say is, and this is an interesting problem that human beings have, we tend to want things to be more alike than we want them to be different. And that really skews our perception. Not to totally nerd out, but contagion was a paramyxovirus. It's not a coronavirus. They're very different things. So we didn't get that right. We got the idea of a wet market correct, but we knew that because that had been where SARS had come from. Now, is it possible that this walked out of a lab? Yeah, I guess it is. Chances are we will never know. The greatest likelihood, because science has shown us so many other viruses, especially, this century, whether it's SARS or MERS, that are other coronaviruses, is that we seem to have an interesting human reaction to coronaviruses that we're only now coming to really fully understand. And that, to me, brings up an even greater misunderstanding that I would love to really get the scientists on this call to help with, which is science is about what we know in that moment. And it needs to be allowed to be wrong and revised. That's how we survive, and that's how we rely on science. And so when even people in my community are like, yeah, but that's, but it was wrong. Well, it wasn't wrong. It was right for what the empirical method could tell us about that moment in time. And I tend to be among the cohort that wants to bet on the empirical method.
And you wanted George to answer that question. Can science dream a little bit ahead of reality? Is that kind of the question? Can it be wrong? And can you rephrase that question? So
no, I got it. It's a good question. I think we're actually science, or at least my brand of science, which is on the kind of cutting edge, is very indebted to the artists, the writers and the screenwriters, heavily influenced by Jurassic Park and by Contagion and even documentaries like An Inconvenient Truth. These things, they make it so graphic. Extrapolations, I had thought about flooding, but seeing it going into a synagogue up to their knees, it just somehow it makes it more urgent, more inspiring. So that definitely, can we make these things? Will this inspire us to take chances and be wrong? I think the best scientists are not too concerned about being wrong, as long as they're not hurting people. That's the main thing. That's why the FDA is set up to be so careful about these clinical trials. And I think it's a wonderful story that we did get this vaccine in 11 months without hurting people. And it was really a remarkably safe, even though it was wildly new technology. It not only wasn't just another vaccine. Just if it had just been another vaccine, even another flu vaccine takes a year to get approved. And that's almost exactly the same. This was wildly different. This messenger RNA had never been tried out before. Anyway, so yeah, thanks for the question, Scott. It's it does inspire us to take chances, and it is nice to have the art accurately reflecting how we can be wrong. It's all about successive approximation, and these days it's exponential successive approximation, which works.
And just to follow up on that, I can't remember when I first came across the first article that mentioned George and the de-extinction of the mammoth, but I instantly wanted to do, and it was for a while, an episode of Extrapolations where I wanted to show mammoths charging across, this area and turning the earth and, and doing all sorts of great things. Weirdly, and George, I don't know if you know this, it was also really inspired by God, what's his name? I think Frank Popper at Rutgers, who wanted to reintroduce the American bison and turn like this part of America that is economically really challenged back into a grassland. Because if you have the bison charging around and turning the earth, and you get away from monoculture, you can do some pretty remarkable things to rehabilitate the planet. So I was very, very excited about that. If they gave me another season, I would probably be on the phone with George day one going, all right, so how do we make that work?
All right, for the people in the audience, this is your opportunity to call your favorite Apple execs and tell them exactly that you want a season 2 of this. So, maybe on this like question of responsibility and danger and, what happens to people, the one movie that everybody knows where some de-extinction happens in a big way and then in a bad way maybe is Jurassic Park. So I think everybody on this call is like, well, if we go down this whole thing with the mammoth, then the dinosaurs are next, right? And so the question to you, George, would be, is it even possible? And, give us the super, Harvard 101 1-minute breakdown of how this kind of works at like a really 30,000-foot level that then, probably answers the question, like, would it be possible to bring back dinosaurs after all? And is Jurassic Park actually somewhat closer to science?
Well, before I get to the 1 minute, I have to
Sure.
say I have two connections to maybe three to Jurassic Park. When I first read the book, I think it was 1990 or something, I realized this is the first fiction book I've seen that has an entire page of DNA sequence on it, G's, A's, T's, and C's. I said, that's pretty cool. I wonder what it is. They claimed it was dino DNA, and I knew there's no way it was dino DNA back then anyway. We'll get to your question. And so
you said there's a second connection to Jurassic Park.
And this, well, the second one
you're getting there.
is the lysine contingencies. So he made them all addicted to lysine. They had to have it in their diet. The thing is, Michael Crichton was a student at Harvard Medical School, where I'm a professor, and he should have known from his biochemistry class that all animals and all plants have lysine. So that was not actually restricting them to stay in the park. But since then, my team has made a different chemical that isn't present in nature, has to be made in a laboratory. And then that's the version of it. But getting back to Scott's question about success approximation, how you have to be allowed as an artist or a scientist or an artist inventing science to make that little mistake, and we corrected it. But then back to the DNA sequence, I looked at this thing, I say, I wonder what that is. And so back then there weren't really good programs for finding this. They weren't like the Google search. And so I looked it up, and it turned out it was something that I had done as a graduate student about 12 years earlier. It was E. coli plasmid. So it was nothing even close to being a dinosaur. It was a little gut bacterium. Anyway, so to your question, can we find actual dino DNA? Probably, maybe not as convenient as a mosquito and amber, although again, I won't say anything's impossible. Our record right now is 2 million years. That's the oldest one. And to put it in perspective, when people were doing the first ancient DNA, sequencing them, using methods, some of the methods that my team developed, 10,000 years was considered like some kind of record. And then it became 100,000. And then it crept its way all the way up to 2 million. So I wouldn't put it out of the question that you could get further back than that. Also, that there may be rather than getting DNA, you might be able to get the impression that DNA leaves on the rocks. That's not out of the question. And as machine learning gets better and better at reading kind of fuzzy images, we might be, and there's always redundancy as our friend. That's what makes sequencing work so well, is you read one strand with a few errors, and you read another strand with different errors, and then you figure it out. So I would say it's not out of the question, but also you have the possibility of figuring out what the dinosaur was genetically without ever reading its DNA. You can infer from what we know about developmental biology of chickens, which are dinosaurs, and ostriches, and living dinosaurs, and then you can and then all sorts of related animals, the Komodo dragon and so forth, and you can piece together what the genome might have been like. So it's not really fiction; it's very well informed developmental biology embodied in genetics. So it's not out of the question in two different ways.
Got it. Yeah, one of the things that we found on writing our guide is basically the problem of this half-life time. So for everybody in the audience that's not familiar with half-life time outside of nuclear physics, where you're like, okay, this thing falls apart every XYZ years, it basically, half of it gets destroyed. With DNA, the half-life time is around like 500 years or so. So each DNA thing gets gradually more and more damaged over time. Do I understand it correctly? And so then the method that you would need to use to actually bring back dinosaurs would be different from what basically Jurassic Park sort of implied.
Well, I just need to put a caveat. That half-life is
yeah.
on the presence of water. So if you have an anhydrous DNA sample, its half-life is a lot longer than that. I think we need to be cautious about saying something's impossible.
I love it. I love it. This is the science and fiction totally, coming together. Dream big and dream into the future. This is great. I'm learning just as much as everybody else on the call, so that's really good. Even though I've spent way too much time in this already, and yeah. So then maybe Scott, to bring your two stories together and really like have this full sort of a mashup that I think everybody in the audience is waiting for. There's a storyline in Extrapolations that is extremely close to what George is working on, obviously with a somewhat different, maybe a more dystopian or more capitalist kind of outcome. But can you tell us about that storyline, about the extinct species, and about Menagerie 2100?
Yeah, so that was sort of an evolving storyline. When I wrote that script, it was actually the first script I had written. And I thought it might even be a good stage play. I had not, it existed before the TV show did. And I had called Meryl Streep and talked to her about it, and she read it and loved it and wanted to do it. And so I then started thinking, how do I make this more in the language of this show? Because there's a lot that would be beautiful at first blush about being able to save the whales. And so I had to try and balance that out by what would be sort of a more wicked application of this. And so, generally my view is that, science is benign, and that human beings are usually the practitioners, and human beings can be flawed, and that's how you wind up with eugenics. Although maybe I'm wrong about that. So George, if I am, please correct me. But what I wanted to do, and what happens without giving away too much, is there's a scientist who has been able to speak to a whale. The weirdest part about this story is I was contacted as soon as the show came out by a group oddly called SETI. It's a different SETI than the one in space, but they've been working on whale communication, and they virtually said, like, did you have a leak from our lab? Because what you're doing is exactly like what we're doing. But this person is able to have a conversation with a whale. For me, because the story was very much about losing my father, it was really cathartic to write it. And what is beautiful sometimes in storytelling is these very personal stories then become available for you to consider them in a larger context. And for me, the context was, what if someone looked at the world and looked at species that were facing extinction and decided they were going to build, oops, sorry. I guess my dog didn't like me saying anything about extinction. But if they built an IP bank and controlled the existence of these animals, and I was thinking a lot about VR when I wrote that, and I was like, does VR and things like these Apple Vision Pros become problematic because it makes nature replaceable for people? And will it help us value animals more, or does it make them something we can let go of because we can put them right in front of our face? And so I wanted to come up with a company that was going to bank all of this stuff and reintroduce it when the planet was healthier. And how does that feel? How does it feel to have people take control over DNA for their own profits? And it was really in some ways less a condemnation than an invitation to a discussion, because I'm so fascinated by George's work and other people's work that it was fun for me to write something where the moral compass sort of spun freely at the end, and you had to come to your own sort of conclusion about, if we've made the world unlivable, is it not on us, if we have the science to save aspects of the world, to do that? And then where does that lead? Which is a part of a conversation around species loss that I've had with Elizabeth Colbert at the New Yorker, and it became a really fun intellectual playground.
That's really awesome. I think in the intellectual playground front, there's the storytelling at the intellectual playground, and then there's the science one. And I feel like sometimes the dreaming big is sort of what attracts us to certain science, just like dreaming big in stories, or maybe dreaming personal in stories that makes it relatable. And then sometimes dreaming big in science is sort of what attracts a lot of us. And George, when you dream big, you didn't dream of a small herbivore somewhere in the Alaskan tundra, but you dreamt of just about the biggest one imaginable, about 4,000 years ago or so, when the last woolly mammoth trampled the earth roundabout, right? This is like a really crazy animal to pick. And you already explained earlier why you ended up actually sort of backing into trying to bring back the mammoths. So they were sort of like your choice, I think, from day zero. But can you tell us a little bit about what kind of challenges do you encounter? Do you sometimes get yourself in this Jurassic World kind of territory where you start asking kind of big questions of, how long will this take? Will we be successful? What happens when we introduce them? So maybe share a little bit with us, both the scientific and then maybe also the ethical and sort of bigger picture world implications that come with it. And for everybody that's listening, we thought about doing this panel actually in person in LA with both George and Scott on stage. And one thing that we learned is that George doesn't travel anymore, i.e. doesn't use airplanes anymore for climate change reasons. So I think everybody on the call here is very aware of CO2, and there's an entire CO2 component to the woolly mammoths. And George, I think, already explained a lot about it in terms of the permafrost and the ability for large herbivores to basically trample down these vegetations and creating a way to bind the CO2 in the Arctic. But George, maybe you can give us a little bit more of this, the challenges that come with trying to bring back woolly mammoths.
Yeah, sure. I think that ethics is one of the things that my group does quite a bit of, and I also call out to PG Ed that Ting Wu and myself and others helped get started in around 2005. It helps bring up these questions. It helps engage screenwriters and writers, and in this case, there are a lot of interesting questions that come up. I think that one of them is making things affordable. Ways of burning energy to bring carbon out of the air is feasible. I mean, I'm not going to say it's impossible, but maybe if you have some more natural process that you can initiate with a little nudge, and then then nature does the rest. And so here the nature is the carbon sequestration that happens every day, especially in grasslands and in the ocean. And you just want it to not. The problem in the ocean, we fix about 1/7 of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere every year. But it immediately turns over, and in the rainforest it turns over. So the question is, how do you keep it sequestered? And the Arctic is the perfect place for it, Arctic land, because each year, unlike the rainforest where it turns over, it lays down another layer and it freezes, and it lays down another layer of dust and mammoth poop and whatever. And so it's like 500 meters thick in the carbon rich parts, in contrast to maybe a meter in the forests. So questions come up as we're doing this. These are the kind of ethical things that come up, and we try to listen very carefully, both in my lab and PG Ed, and which is what George, have you been asleep? There's global warming. There's no place for these mammoths to go back. It's hot in the Siberia, and I can tell you, I've been to Siberia, and even in the summertime, it's freezing, and in the wintertime, it's minus 40 degrees centigrade, or Fahrenheit, same thing, at minus 40. So then there's a place for them, but we don't necessarily want to make something. We want something that's adapted to the modern world. Cold is not the problem; it's viruses. So we have the ethical thing of 25% or more of newborns are dying from a herpes virus. This is contributing to the extinction. All the elephants all the elephants in the world are endangered species, and these are particularly so because of this herpes virus. So we'd like to add that to it, and that's not coming from the mammoths. That's coming from, our dedication to the species, this very charismatic megafauna. People ask, well, if you just bring one back, it'll be this lonely thing sitting in a cement zoo. Well, that's not what we're doing. If you can critique us, critique what we're actually doing. We're trying to bring it back to the wild. And in fact, our collaborators now, Sergei Zemov originally was just an inspiration. Now we're collaborating, and he has 160 square kilometers set aside in Siberia with a government commitment to provide him however much he needs in the future. And he's restored about 10 species of mega herbivores. The only one he's missing is the one that will knock over trees. And if you want to have some fun, look on the internet for videos of elephants knocking over trees. You can find dozens of them, and they apparently love to do it, even if there's no fruit or leaves at the top. They'll knock it down. So that's what we need. That's our guy. And so how are you going to interfere with the ethical questions? Are you going to interfere with the reproduction of of this? Maybe there's 20,000 Asian elephants that are reproductive age and female. Are you going to interfere with them to get the eggs? Well, we're working on ways that we can make eggs in vitro from elephant cells, so they can do their regular reproduction, and we can scale up without bothering them. Is it going to be enough and soon enough? Well, I've had the strange experience of watching a bunch of things arrive earlier than we expected. So, if you looked at the expectations for when we would have an affordable genome sequencing for human genomes, it was expected to be a century away. In fact, even at Moore's law rate, which is a fast exponential for computers, it was supposed to be 6 decades away, and it ended up being more like 6 to 10 years. So, it takes at least 10 years to get to a maturity where they're knocking down trees like crazy, but it may not take that long to get to the first embryo, the first engineered calf. And that could go on. There are lots and lots of challenges, and I think it's great to have these discussions. And for every challenge, there's a response, and for every response, there's another challenge, and this is all part of the discussion.
That's awesome. So we're about 5 minutes out from finishing, and I wanted to open it up to everybody in the audience. You can just type questions into the chat. We've got a few questions up there, and maybe one that I can fold a few questions into one. So there was a few questions like what can be done by storytellers, and maybe I'll ask you, Scott. You know, I think you took sort of a big burden and responsibility on you, both with Inconvenient Truth and then with Extrapolations, and saying, look, maybe I can do a piece of warning people and of giving them an idea of what the future might look like if we don't do the right things. Do you have advice for people to that say, you know what, I'm a storyteller, I want to do something in the climate change space, but what should I do? And this is incredibly politically divisive in the US. How do I approach this the right way?
You know, look, I want there to be more climate storytelling. I work with a group called Good Energy that actually goes into writers' rooms and shows people how to put stories into existing programming that reflects climate. You know, Dorothy Fortenberry, who worked on Extrapolations with me, is, you know, always used to say to me, hey, like the real science fiction shows are the ones that pretend the climate isn't going to change. And yet we don't ever talk about that. How someone can make a show right now that's a cop show or a doctor show and pretend that climate is not changing. That to me seems like a really irresponsible move for someone. We have a huge education problem in this country, and I'm loath to think that, you know, Hollywood and entertainment can fix it. But I think we do need to remind people that we are in, you know, what people call the Anthropocene, and that means that this is an age where human activity is changing the world in which we live. I think if we can start there, you know, we can get almost anywhere. I'd like to think that there's a corollary to what George just said about the human genome, and that, you know, it may seem like, oh my God, how are we going to come up with enough stories to get people where we need them to be? And we think it's going to take generations. Maybe it only will take 10 years if we all really work on that. And I think for me as a writer, you know, I used to be a visiting scholar at Stanford, and I would go there and tell people, scientists, you need a story. You need to figure out how to communicate what you're working on to a human being. And as your work becomes more specialized, you can't lose track of that.
That's awesome. I want to respect both of your time because I know it's very valuable and you've got a lot going on, but maybe one closing statement from each of you, maybe something about recommending which areas to focus on for the audience, of saying, look, these are maybe the biggest, most important pieces. Maybe they're not very sexy, maybe they're not very cool, but this is sort of the most important frontier that you've seen in your work in either combating climate change or maybe making people dream a little bit bigger and trying to build a better future. But I'd love if you both can just give us 30 seconds of wisdom each before we wrap it up. George, why don't you start?
Okay, so I think carbon sequestration is going to be key. It's not enough that we just tighten our belts and stop using SUVs and turn off all the lights at sunset or never turn them on. I think we really need to bring it back down to 280, back to pre-industrial levels, and we can do that. And I think that it's not as divisive as it used to be. I think that there are a lot of, you know, Republicans and Democrats who can see their way to a profit. There are a lot of Europeans that are willing to say, okay, this is the one thing I'll accept GMOs for. I've actually heard these comments. So. So maybe I think maybe this is the challenge of our generation, not necessarily getting to Mars, but fixing our planet, not just slowing down the rate at which it's going to the pot, but actually restoring it. And the bison is a terrific a success story, and it went from about 500 bison to 500,000. It was almost extinct. And now we can restore things. I've watched a bunch of rivers that were polluted turn into now places where people, do windsurfing and, and various other things. So I'm very optimistic about carbon sequestration. I think that really should be our immediate challenge, and we shouldn't set a 50-year goal. We should set a 7-year goal.
Bold, love it. Scott?
I feel that, well, I'll tell a story and people can take from it whatever they will in terms of wisdom. Years ago, I was at a UN convening about climate, and at the time, it had become very fashionable to attack capitalism, and there was a book that was written saying that climate change is really just a symptom of capitalism. And I read the book and I understand that point of view. Personally, I share a lot of that, but here's where I net it out in these groups. I would say, if you're asking me to get rid of capitalism or to get rid of climate change, I think I can get rid of climate change more quickly than I can get rid of capitalism. But I'm going to need capitalism to get rid of climate change. And we need to get rid of climate change. I mean, my hope is that we have so much shit we disagree about in the world. And the one thing we need is a world to continue to disagree and refine our thinking. So we got to work on that. And what George said is exactly right. Carbon sequestration and other technologies do give people profits. And if that motivates them, then great. We don't have really a choice anymore. And yeah, the unethical behavior of people is astonishing. But I don't see how we have any other choice.
Awesome. Cool. Well, then I'll wrap up the panel for everybody else that attended. So both a big virtual applause for both of you guys to be here today. I mean, this was a fantastic conversation. I learned a ton. And for everyone else that wants to go a little bit deeper into this, both SAE Society and PGED, we published or co-published a guide on storytelling and de-extinction that also gives you a lot of thoughts about climate change and about how to use these things in your own storytelling. So feel free to check the link that's in the chat. You can also go on the PGED website or on the SAE Society website. There will be more panels like this. So we're looking forward to these, but big thank you to both of you for taking your time and sharing wisdom that I think is very rare in the same room. So really, really appreciate it. It's great.